Now let's turn to the social science aspect of our method for answering the question, is Jesus mythological? Whereas from the narratological aspect, we utilize Prop, Fontaine-Rose, and Forsyth to identify the typical pattern of myths motifs for comparison and contrast with Jesus' pattern, we'll make use of René Girard's and Bruce Malina's social scientific work to identify the typical pattern of myth culture's episodes, that is, the pattern of social identity, speech, and behavior typical of members of myth cultures, those who believe the myths and live by them, imitating their gods. And then we'll compare and contrast myth culture's pattern of behavior with Jesus' pattern of identity, speech, and behavior as recorded in the gospel accounts. And I'm proposing here that, as I said, everyone else in the gospel accounts follows the pattern of myth culture, which has 6 typical episodes, and we'll see how that relates to the 12 motifs in a moment. While Jesus' pattern of episodes is not the same as that of myth culture. They're opposites, they're diametrically opposed. And we'll start with Bruce Malina's identification of the nature of myth culture, or the living out of the cultural story, as he puts it. Malina doesn't speak of a pattern or sequence of stages or events, but he does identify what he calls models, that is, or features. I translate features for us to understand. So in no specific order, Malina observes certain features of the social values and behaviors of groups that recur, that are typical, and that are directly related to their shared cultural story, their myth. Malina recognizes 6 principal social models, staple features, of what he calls the 81st century Mediterranean culture. That is, Malina considers these models as typical of the myth culture of the society or societies in which Jesus of Nazareth lived. And they are, number 1, as you see on the slide, honor, shame. This is the primary lens for Malina. Secondly, dyadism. Third, envy. Fourth, limited good. Fifth, purity, impurity. And 6th, marriage, kinship. To briefly summarize these models or features of myth culture and its members, firstly, honor, shame. And honor, shame involves the notion that conscience equals culture. That as a member of myth culture's sense of right and wrong is determined by no greater authority than his or her social milieu, his social group. There's no higher or universal sense of morality than the group. So this is a distinctly mythological concept and worldview. Honor is a sense of self-worth received from one's culture, presumably related to how well that person imitates the culture's gods. And shame is a member's concern for sensitivity to how well other members of his myth culture think of him. In a myth culture, then, it's a positive thing to be worried about what other people think of you. Hopefully that's not what your mother taught you. It's not what my mother taught me. But that's how a member of myth culture thinks of himself. So honor can be summarized as one's reputation, and shame is concern for one's reputation. So a sense of one's honor, shame, and dishonor are entirely socially determined, according to Malina, according to myth culture. Ultimately, then, the primary goal of a good person is to be well thought of by other people, to be praised by men, by human beings. That's the mythological view. Secondly, dyadism, and this involves the idea that a member of myth culture's identity is only ever in relation to his or her group or culture, so very similarly related to honor, shame. We can see how this relates to honor, shame, then. Members of myth cultures are dyadic in that they need other members continually to know who they really are. So they're defined by those around them. That's their sense of identity. And this is how myth culture replaces, from a Christian perspective, it replaces the true God of the Bible with the God of the crowd, the culture. Because instead of a person looking to his or her creator to define him or her for his or her identity, she looks instead to other human beings, other members of the myth culture. And it's for this reason that there's the Latin motto, which goes, Vox populi vox Dei, the voice of the people is the voice of God. That's the mythological God of man's own making, the God of myth, the fabrication of the group. So thirdly, out of this collective deception and idolization of one another, of the group, which characterizes myth culture, there arises the third feature or model that Malina identifies, which is envy. So drawing on Aristotle, Malina defines envy as pain at the success of the other, which precipitates all manner of ill treatment of the other to gain the life of the other. Envy. And fourthly, that envy that arises out of being defined by those around you, and so desiring to be and to have what those around you are and have, gives rise in turn to the fourth feature here, which is the belief that it's only possible to get what you want at the expense of the other, which is the idea of limited good. So this is the fourth model or feature, limited good, which is the thinking that good or goods, which includes social position, prosperity, pleasure, power, prestige, progress, what's good in life, is only acquirable at the expense of someone else. So a member of myth culture believes in scapegoating as necessary to succeed in life, just as the myth we just read depicted. Someone's got to die for my world, my life, my success to take place. For me to win, to live a good life, someone else must suffer, must die. That's the thinking of members of myth culture. So Molina writes, limited good means individuals, alone or with their family, can improve their social position only at the expense of others. And the fifth model identified by Molina is purity-impurity, which is the observation that members of myth cultures, particularly at the leadership level, are concerned with preserving the social purity and religious hierarchy of their group by forming and maintaining boundaries for those deemed to be unclean by the insiders of the myth culture. So not only do members of myth culture form their identity based on what other people think of them and desire what other people have and are, and gain it by scapegoating one another, they actively try to pressure those they view as unworthy to leave and or to marginalize those they consider to be not one of us, one of us. The sixth model or feature of myth culture that Molina describes is marriage kinship, which is, from the perspective of myth culture, just a subset of purity-impurity, really, but more specifically concerning family relations. Instead of marriage and family being a source of encouragement, peace, joy, and security in a meaningful way, as biblically speaking God intended, marriage and kinship are simply tools to achieve and or maintain the purity of the myth culture by marginalizing family members or potential family members that are viewed as unclean, for gaining worldly goods by scapegoating, and the other aforementioned features of myth culture. So obviously, these are perversions of what marriage and family were intended to be about, and yet these perversions are typical of myth culture, which prioritizes this socially determined honor-shame ideology. René Girard, for his part, makes similar observations about the nature of myth culture and its members, but Girard observes more. He sees that these features of myth culture actually unfold in a pattern or sequence of behaviors that repeats in an endless cycle. As Girard writes, archaic religions and their sacrificial systems are an economy of scapegoating that violently evacuates internal violence, which is to say it expels constant social frustrations of the myth culture's members. And remember, they all want what each other have and are, so there's a lot of frustration there. And myth culture does this through the endless repetition of ritual by scapegoating individuals and minorities. So Girard also articulates 6 features of myth culture, but he observes their sequential nature, that they occur in a typical sequence or pattern. And Girard doesn't systematize these as I've done in Jesus and Myth, but he tends, as I pointed out previously, he tends to speak of the 3-part pattern of chaos, scapegoat, cosmos. But as I showed you last time, and as you find on page 15 of the book Jesus and Myth, there are certainly 6 episodes or stages of this pattern when looked at from the social scientific side of things. Girard describes these 6 stages, but he doesn't fully organize them or clearly lay them out systematically. So these 6 episodes are another way of describing, from the social science aspect, the 12 motifs of combat myth. So they're both the 6 episodes and the 12 motifs, one from the social science perspective, one from the narratological perspective, both describe the same reality, the same pattern of myth culture. And Girard moves beyond Molina in observing that it's not merely ancient myth cultures that are characterized by this pattern, but all human culture is myth culture, every human culture, and every individual member of every culture follows these 6 episodes over and over and over again. This pattern is lived out by individual members on a daily basis and by entire groups. The first episode for Girard is also simply a default state for members of myth culture, their starting position at any given moment, rather like Molina's honor-shame model that we just talked about. For Girard, the first episode is borrowed desire, which he calls mimesis, which is just a Greek word for imitation, which Girard uses to mean imitation of desire. So Girard begins about where Molina does, by observing the true individuality for members of myth culture. Let me repeat that. Girard begins by observing that the true individuality for members of myth culture is illusory, since in myth culture, as Molina already observed, every member is driven by his or her desires, and his or her desires are always someone else's desires, wanting what someone else is or has. So the group's desire, the culture's desire, is imitated by the individual. He doesn't have his own autonomous desire, it's always borrowed. Adam's race doesn't know what it wants, so it looks to others to decide for them what to want, and doesn't look where it should, as the scriptures lay out, but looks to other people. And this borrowed desire determines their sense of identity, their thinking, and their behavior. So it's not so different from Molina's first two models, honor, shame, and dietism, as we've just seen. Instead of being individuals, then, says Girard, members of myth culture, all cultures, are actually interdividuals, since they rely on others for their identity, their being, their sense of social existence. So that's the first episode. It's just where we're all at as members of myth culture. Secondly, then, Girard describes the second stage or logical consequence of members of a group borrowing their desires from one another, which is scandal, offense. And scandal, or being offended, is the inevitable moment, which is a daily occurrence, of two or more people's shared desire causing conflict, when a person feels blocked or impeded from accessing the object of his or her desire because someone else is in his or her way, is getting there first, etc. So this corresponds to Molina's envy model, I would say. And it's at this stage that the scandalized person fixes all blame for the ill will, the envy, the blocked desire on the person who's perceived to be the source of the scandal, and decides on some level that the scandal, that person, needs to be sacrificed, needs to be scapegoated, to get what the mythological person feels he or she needs to really be, to really live. It feels like a life and death situation, since the myth cultural person's sense of identity and existence depends on this borrowed desire. And let me say, with the light of the gospel, what idolatry this is, right? What idol making of one's neighbors this is, really. Thirdly, and as I said, Girard describes all this as a sequence of events. And the next event in the sequence, then, the third stage or episode, may be termed mimetic snowballing, or the accumulation of scandal, the escalation of the crisis of unmet desire toward the act of scapegoating. Fourthly, then, the fourth stage in this ever-repeating sequence of events is the scapegoating event itself, when the scandalized member or members finally get their hands on their victim and proclaim his, her, or their guilt and imminent doom for the good of the scandalized member or members of the myth culture, the majority, or in any case, the one or ones who will survive and tell their twisted story, their version of events, how they heroically eliminated the monster, as we saw with Zeus and Typhon. Fifthly, the fifth stage or episode is when everyone who participated in the scapegoating share in the spoils of their scapegoating, their shared collective victim. Everyone gets a piece of the pie, a limb or of the victim's corpse, literally or metaphorically. So this is the consumption event, the feasting upon or devouring of the scapegoat by the mythological group, literally or metaphorically, or both. Sixth and finally, the sixth stage comes like the calm that comes over all the dinner party guests once they're well fed and drunk, the temporary calm, peace, cosmos, peace as the world gives it, the reestablishment of differences in a forced, fabricated hierarchical order, everything back as it ought to be, everything's right with the world once again, once that scandalous individual or minority has been put back in their place, and the victim is safely entombed or imprisoned in the earth. The kind of imagery we saw there in the myth. So all members of myth culture follow this pattern every day, at all times. Is there any escape from this grotesque cycle of scapegoating, of destructive and lethal self-interest, ever predicated upon idolizing one another's desires? And is this pattern of existence Jesus' pattern as found in the gospel accounts? That's the big question for us here. And I propose that we'll find that not only is Jesus not a mythological God, not conforming to the pattern of the combat myth, but he's not a mythological man either. Jesus is not mythical either in his deity or in his humanity, unlike the rest of us.